My son abandoned me in the dead of winter. I remember the moment as if it were yesterday. Snow drifted across the steps outside my apartment building, freezing my fingers to the doorknob. He stood there, suitcase in hand, staring at me with eyes that once held trust and warmth. "Mom, I can't stay here anymore. I need space," he said. Just like that, he left. My heart shattered. My blood froze. But what I discovered next changed everything. I had always been proud of him. My little boy, the one who used to hide behind my skirts when strangers came by, had grown into a man, or at least that was what I believed. My name is Helen. I'm 68, and I run this modest apartment building with my own two hands. My life has always been simple but honest. I wake up with the sun, check on my tenants, make sure everyone's rent is on time, and then I bake. Bread, pies, sometimes cookies. It smells like home. It feels like love. And yet, even as I prepared breakfast that morning, I felt the first shiver of something I couldn't yet name. Something was off. My son, Darren, had been living with me rent-free for years. I told myself it was because he was starting out, finding his way, trying to get his career in order. I reminded myself daily, I am helping him. I am giving him a chance. But looking back now, I see the warning signs I ignored. The half-smile when I reminded him to pay bills. The excuses, the sighs, the way he rolled his eyes when I asked him to take out the trash. It should have been enough to notice. But I loved him. And love, it clouds judgment like a thick fog. Our mornings were usually quiet, filled with small routines. I would bring him his coffee just the way he liked it, cream, 2 sugars, and he would sit at the worn wooden table, scrolling through his phone, nodding politely as I asked about his day. "Busy," he'd say. "It's fine, Mom." I thought it was the stress of adulthood. I thought he needed support, guidance. I never imagined he was plotting abandonment. I can still hear his footsteps echoing down the hallway that morning. The suitcase wheels squeaked over the floor, a sound that now haunts me. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just left, as if I were a stranger. I watched through the frosted window as he disappeared into the storm. I pressed my hands to the glass, feeling the cold seep through my bones. My neighbors peeked out from their doors, concern in their eyes. "Is he leaving?" one whispered. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I understood it myself. Was this betrayal, or a young man's selfishness? Maybe both. I spent the rest of the day in silence, moving through my apartment mechanically. I brewed tea I couldn't taste. I chopped vegetables for a soup I wouldn't eat. The silence was deafening. His bedroom, once a cluttered mess of video games and clothes, was empty, pristine. It was as if he had vanished from my life entirely. And in that empty room, I began to feel the sting of humiliation. Not just as a mother, but as a woman who had been taken for granted, underestimated, discarded. Yet life goes on, even when your heart is breaking. I checked the building. The tenants greeted me warmly, oblivious to my private storm. Mrs. Callahan from 2B asked if I had the pie recipe I'd promised her. I forced a smile. "Of course, dear. I'll send it over today." No one noticed the trembling of my hands, the tightness in my chest, the way I clenched the doorframe as I walked from apartment to apartment. They didn't see the betrayal etched in my bones. No one did. That's when the thought first struck me. A dangerous, thrilling, terrifying thought. He thinks he can walk away from me. He thinks I'm helpless. He doesn't know me. I started to notice small things that he had left behind. A pair of sneakers by the door, his phone charger tangled like a forgotten web, receipts from dinners I hadn't been invited to. It wasn't just that he left, it was how casually he had done it, as if my life, my love, my home were disposable. And with each forgotten item, each trace of his presence, my resolve grew. I would not let him think he could erase me. Not him. Not after everything. Days passed. Snow melted into slush. I carried on with my life, but every glance at the mailbox, every creak on the stairs, made me flinch. Then I noticed something odd. A friend of mine, Mrs. Delgado, mentioned seeing Darren around town, acting as if he were rich, independent, carefree. But he was using my apartment as his safety net, while he flaunted a life I had funded. He had been taking advantage of me all along. The betrayal cut deeper than the cold. The humiliation stung more than the winter wind. And that is when I realized something crucial. I wasn't powerless. I had leverage, I had proof, and I had time. I began to plan in my mind, quietly, cautiously. This wasn't a hasty fury. This was a slow, careful awakening. I would wait. I would observe. I would let him believe he was winning. And then I would make him pay. Not in violence, not in anger, but in the most poetic way I could imagine. My heart beat faster as I considered the possibilities. I could see him scrambling. I could see him realizing that the person he had underestimated was me, his own mother. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, about showing him, and perhaps even myself, that I was not to be dismissed, discarded, or disregarded. I walked through the empty apartment, touching the surfaces he had once taken for granted. I ran my hands over the counter he used carelessly, the sink he had left half-washed dishes in. And I made a silent vow. Everything he had taken, every comfort, every assumption of entitlement, I would turn around, and he would feel the weight of his mistakes. The world outside was cold, unrelenting, but inside me, a fire began to burn. The spark of betrayal had ignited something stronger, a plan. And as I looked out the window, watching the clouds roll in and the wind whip the empty streets, I whispered to myself, "You left me in the cold, Darren, but the game has only just begun." It kept getting worse. I thought the hardest part was seeing him leave, but no. The betrayal wasn't just a suitcase and a cold goodbye. It was deeper, crueler. It was the little lies, the secrets, the way he treated me like I was invisible. 2 days after he left, I received a call from Mrs. Delgado. Her voice was nervous, almost guilty. "Helen, I saw Darren at that new cafe downtown. He has been telling people he lives on his own. Renting an apartment, paid for it himself." I froze. My mind spun. What?" I barely whispered. "Yes," she continued. "But I know he still has your apartment key. He's been letting friends crash there, using your place. And, Helen, he's been posting pictures online, showing off things that came from you." I hung up. The receiver slipped from my hand. My kitchen, my home, suddenly felt like a stage for a cruel joke. He wasn't just abandoning me, he was mocking me, mocking my kindness, my love, my trust. I had fed him, sheltered him, given him years of my life. And now, he paraded my generosity as if it were his own. I confronted him over the phone the next day. I tried to keep my voice steady, but inside, my blood boiled. "Darren," I said, "I know what you've been doing. My apartment, your friends, the pictures online. What is this?" There was a pause. Then, his casual, infuriating tone. "Oh, Mom, you worry too much. It's not like I'm stealing from you. I just borrowed it. Temporary. You know, for friends. Borrowed, I snapped. You left me in the snow. You left me humiliated, and you still have the audacity to call it borrowing? There was a laugh on the other end, light and dismissive. You're overreacting. Relax, it's fine. Really? I hung up, shaking. His laughter echoed in my ears long after the call ended. He had become unrecognizable. I barely recognized the man who had once clung to my skirts, afraid of the dark. This was a stranger, cruel and calculating, using me as a stepping stone. It didn't end there. I started noticing strange charges on my account, small amounts siphoned away. Groceries, online subscriptions, deliveries I never ordered. I traced them, all to him. Darren had been quietly exploiting my trust, turning my home, my resources, into his personal playground. The next day, I confronted my neighbor, Mr. Lopez, a quiet man who lived 2 floors down. Have you seen Darren lately? I asked. He hesitated. Well, yes. He's been coming around, bringing friends. They hang out in your apartment when you're out. I thought he lived somewhere else. You mean he's been living there illegally? I demanded. Technically, yes, he said softly, but he seems comfortable. I felt a surge of anger so sharp, it took my breath away. Comfortable. Comfortable while I, his own mother, had been abandoned, humiliated, and frozen in my own home. Then came the humiliation at the market. I went to pick up groceries, trying to distract myself from the storm brewing in my mind, and ran into one of his friends. Hey, Mrs. Helen, the young man said cheerfully. Darren says hi. He says thanks for letting us crash at your place last night. He said you're amazing. I blinked, my hands tightening around my shopping bag. Letting you crash? I whispered, almost to myself. Yes, your apartment. He says you're generous. Really generous. I forced a polite smile, but inside, my stomach churned. Generous? They didn't know generosity. They only knew entitlement, deceit, and betrayal. I walked out of the store, the winter wind cutting across my face. But it was nothing compared to the cold that had settled in my chest. I went home and discovered the mess he had left behind. My kitchen, usually tidy, had remnants of fast food containers he and his friends had left. My living room bore signs of their presence. Socks on the floor, empty soda cans, and worst of all, a pile of bills he had ignored, some with late fees. The audacity of it made my hands shake. My son, my own flesh and blood, had turned my home into a playground while I suffered in silence. I tried calling him again. This time, I was calmer, deliberately calm, but the anger simmered beneath the surface. Darren, I said, we need to talk, now, about everything. Your use of my apartment, your lies. I don't have time, Mom, he interrupted. I'm busy. Maybe later. Maybe later? I repeated, my voice rising. You left me in the cold. You humiliated me in front of everyone. You think later fixes that? He laughed again. That same infuriating laugh that made me want to scream. Relax. You'll be fine. I'm just figuring life out. Don't take it personally. I slammed the phone down, heart hammering. I had to stop myself from dialing back immediately, from screaming, from doing something I might regret. I realized then that he had no shame, no guilt, only entitlement, only arrogance, and it didn't stop. Every day, a new indignity, packages delivered to my door, addressed to him. Unpaid bills that somehow came back to me, text messages from friends thanking me for allowing them to use my space. One particularly cruel morning, I found a note slipped under my door. Thanks for the place, Mom. It's awesome. Love, Darren. Love? I balled the note in my hands, shaking with fury and disbelief. He had taken my love my kindness, my home, and twisted it into a tool for his amusement. Every word felt like a knife in my heart. I paced my apartment, the walls closing in, the betrayal suffocating. I remember sitting down at my kitchen table that evening, my head in my hands, tears running down my cheeks. I felt broken, humiliated, powerless, and yet a strange thought crept in, quiet at first. A whisper. He thinks I'm weak. He thinks I can't stop him. He thinks he owns me. I looked around my apartment, the home I had built, cared for, lived in, and suddenly I didn't feel powerless at all. I felt sharp. I felt cunning. I realized the betrayal wasn't just a wound. It was a weapon I could use. I had proof. I had legal ownership. I had everything he had overlooked. That night, I went to my filing cabinet and pulled out the rental agreements, the ownership papers, every document that confirmed I was the landlord, the master of this building, the one person with ultimate control. And a plan began to form. Slowly, carefully, calculated. I would wait. I would watch. And when the time was right, he would learn exactly what it means to betray me. I hit my lowest point one rainy afternoon. The sky was a heavy gray, and the wind rattled the windows like it wanted to shake the truth out of me. I had just returned from the post office, where another package meant for Darren had been delivered to my door. Inside, a brand new laptop. I held it in my hands, and for a moment, I let myself imagine the audacity, the sheer entitlement it represented. My own son, using my name, my home, my money, to live a life he had no right to. I sank into my favorite chair, the one that had seen decades of laughter and tears. I felt small, broken, humiliated. It wasn't just that he had abandoned me, it was the way he had done it, the way he flaunted my resources, my generosity, my love, like they were nothing. I cried. I let it all out. And yet, even in my despair, a seed began to grow, a tiny spark of something dangerous. I remembered a conversation I had with Mrs. Delgado a few weeks earlier, one that had seemed trivial at the time. She had mentioned that Darren had been bragging to his friends that he had connections in town, that he could get away with anything. He had been careless, assuming no one would ever hold him accountable. He thought I was weak. He thought I was just an old woman with no power. He was wrong. That night, I went through my filing cabinet again. Ownership papers, rental agreements, keys, legal notices. My fingers trembled as I sifted through them. And then I found it, a clause I had nearly forgotten. The building's bylaws clearly stated that tenants who did not have a formal lease agreement could be evicted immediately. And since Darren had never paid a cent in rent, never signed a lease, and had been using my property without permission, he was completely at my mercy. I felt a shiver of anticipation mixed with fury. The betrayal had been complete, but now the opportunity to reclaim control was mine. The seed of revenge sprouted into a plan. The next day, I observed Darren from a distance. He was walking down the street with his friends, laughing loudly, carrying coffee cups like he owned the world. I noticed how careless he was with his phone, how distracted, how sure of himself. That arrogance, the very thing that had cut me to the bone, was going to be his downfall. I started collecting evidence, pictures, receipts, messages, everything that proved he had been using my apartment without permission, spending my money, and lying about his independence. Each piece of proof made my resolve stronger. Every lie he had told me, every time he smiled while ignoring my feelings, became fuel. I also realized I needed an ally, someone who could help me execute the plan. I called Mr. Lopez, my neighbor from 2 floors down. He was quiet, unassuming, and he had seen everything. "Mr. Lopez," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I need your help. It's about Darren. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. I've seen what he's been doing. I didn't want to get involved, but if you need me, I'm here. I smiled, a small, cruel twist of a smile. I didn't trust many people, but he had witnessed Darren's arrogance firsthand. He could corroborate my claims if needed. He became my quiet ally, my observer, my witness. Over the next few days, I moved with deliberate patience. I didn't rush. I couldn't afford to make mistakes. Every phone call I made, every conversation I had, was calculated. I planted seeds of doubt in Darren's friends, casually mentioning that the building had strict rules, that unauthorized tenants could face consequences. I watched as his confidence began to waver ever so slightly. It was subtle, but it was there. At home, I practiced my confrontation. I rehearsed my words in front of the mirror, imagining his smug face crumbling under the weight of the truth. I thought about how he would react, how he would plead, how he would try to twist the situation, and I smiled because I knew I was ready. I also reminded myself why this was necessary, not just for the apartment, not just for the humiliation he deserved, but for me. I would not let him walk over me. I would not allow his betrayal to define my life. I had been pushed into the cold, abandoned when I needed him most. But I was no longer powerless. I had leverage, I had strategy, and most importantly, I had patience. One evening, while reviewing my notes, I found another advantage. Darren had become careless with his online presence. Photos, posts, check-ins, all evidence of his entitlement. He had not considered that I, the person he had abandoned and humiliated, would notice. But I did. Every online brag, every casual lie, became a thread I could pull. And when I did, it would unravel him completely. I remember leaning back in my chair, the room dimly lit by a single lamp. Rain pattered against the window, a soft, steady rhythm that mirrored my heartbeat. I felt a rush of anticipation, a thrill I hadn't experienced in years. The betrayal had nearly broken me, but now it was transforming into power. I was no longer just a victim. I was a strategist, a force to be reckoned with. I thought about Darren, walking through the streets as if he owned them, laughing with friends, oblivious to the storm brewing. I pictured the moment he would realize he had underestimated me, that his arrogance would be his undoing, and I knew with a deep certainty that the plan would work. But I had to wait. Patience was part of the strategy. I couldn't act too soon. I had to let him feel safe, untouchable. Only then would the revelation hit him hardest. Every night, I reviewed my evidence, refined my plan, and imagined the confrontation. My emotions were a mix of anger, hurt, and a strange exhilaration. I was walking a fine line between revenge and justice, and the line was thrilling. I didn't sleep much those nights. I paced the apartment, checking locks, double-checking documents, ensuring every detail was perfect. I couldn't afford mistakes. I had been betrayed, yes, but I would not let that betrayal define me. I would define myself. And in that quiet, tense anticipation, I felt a shift inside me. The helplessness, the humiliation, the pain, they were still there, but they were no longer chains. They were weapons. I would use them. And when I did, Darren would learn a lesson he would never forget. For the first time since he had abandoned me in the cold, I felt hope. Not hope in him, not hope that he would come to his senses, but hope in myself. Hope that I could turn this betrayal into something powerful, something clever, something entirely mine. And so, I waited, patient, calculating, aware of every move he made, every slip he took. The storm had begun inside me, and soon it would spill over, sweeping him away in its wake. I waited. I watched. Every day, Darren strutted through the city as if he had won, flaunting his independence, showing off the things I had quietly provided. He didn't notice me. He didn't suspect that the person he had abandoned, humiliated, and exploited was preparing the perfect payback. The first move was subtle. I began sending polite professional notices to his friends, those who had been crashing in my apartment. "Dear tenants," one began, "you are occupying a property without authorization. You are required to vacate immediately. Failure to comply will result in eviction proceedings." I mailed them carefully with a calm, almost cheerful tone. My handwriting was neat, my language firm but courteous. I smiled as I imagined Darren discovering that his so-called freedom was about to collapse. Then came the call he didn't see coming. I rang his phone. "Darren," I said sweetly, "I need to speak with you about your living arrangements." "What? Mom, it's fine. I'm fine," he said, flippantly. "Everything's under control." "Is it?" I replied, calm as a winter morning. "Because I've just served eviction notices to your friends, and technically, you don't have any legal right to be in my apartment." There was a pause. I heard the sharp intake of breath over the line. The arrogance had vanished. For the first time in weeks, he sounded uncertain. You can't do that," he stammered. "Oh, I can," I said softly, "and I will. You should have thought about that before you abandoned me, before you treated my home and my generosity as your personal playground." The next day, I arrived at the building early. I unlocked the front door, letting myself in as I always had. My tenants watched curiously as I moved through the hallways with quiet authority. I could feel the tension building in me, a delicious thrill. I had control. I was reclaiming what was mine. When Darren finally arrived, it was like watching a man who had lost his footing. He barged through the door, expecting his casual triumph, and instead found me standing in the hallway, calm, resolute, and completely unshaken. "Mom, what is this?" he demanded, eyes wide, scanning the notices I had posted. Eviction warnings, legal statements, proof of his unauthorized tenancy. I let him sweat. I smiled gently. It's what happens when you betray someone who loves you. It's poetic, really. You left me in the cold. Now you'll face a winter of your own making. He tried to argue, tried to claim ignorance, tried to charm me with excuses. "Mom, it's just a misunderstanding. I didn't know. Please, I can fix it." But I didn't waver. I watched him fumble, watched his confidence crumble. Tenants gathered, curious, whispering among themselves. Some had witnessed the chaos, the bills, the mess he had left behind. They whispered of my fairness, my patience, my quiet power. I made him walk through the apartment. Every corner told a story. The kitchen, with its unpaid bills. The living room, with evidence of his carelessness. The bedrooms, neat now, empty of the friends he had exploited. I narrated softly as we went, my words measured, each syllable a blow. "You see, Darren, this is what it looks like to take someone for granted. This is what it looks like when someone thinks they can walk away from love, from respect, from home. And this," I said, holding up the eviction notices, "is what happens when you think you're untouchable." He stammered, tried to protest, but it was too late. His friends had already vacated the apartment, leaving him alone in the cold reality of his reckoning. The tenants nodded quietly, their respect for me clear. No one spoke to him with the same warmth. He had lost every illusion of power. Then came the final act of poetic justice. Darren had been flaunting his independent life online, posting pictures of luxury meals and new gadgets. I calmly printed screenshots, compiled evidence, and shared it with clear annotations, showing how he had used my resources, my property, and my generosity to fund this facade. The public exposure was quiet, but devastating. Friends, coworkers, even distant relatives began questioning him. His pride, carefully built on lies and entitlement, crumbled. He sent messages, frantic and pleading, but no one wanted to defend him. He had burned every bridge, and I had handed him the map to his own downfall. I watched him on the street one afternoon, his phone glued to his ear, face pale, hands shaking. I passed him by calmly, carrying my groceries, smiling softly. He recognized me. I could see the terror flicker in his eyes, but it was too late. The damage was done. His arrogance had met its match in my patience and strategy. And yet, I didn't relish cruelty. This wasn't about anger, it was about justice. I made sure every step I took was fair, legal, undeniable. The satisfaction wasn't in hurting him. It was in restoring what had been mine, reclaiming my dignity, and proving that betrayal has consequences. By the end of that week, Darren had packed his few belongings and left. I did not gloat, not in words. I simply watched him go, the snow swirling around him like a mirror of the first day he had abandoned me. He was gone, humiliated, exposed, and finally, fully aware of what it meant to underestimate someone. I went back into my apartment and locked the door behind me. Silence filled the room, a silence heavy with victory and relief. The warmth of my home returned, untainted by deceit or disrespect. The tenants came by one, offering small gestures of support. Smiles, a plate of cookies, words of thanks. Their respect was a balm, a reminder that kindness and patience are never wasted. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the snow drift down, soft and white. I thought of Darren, finally understanding the cost of his betrayal. I thought of the storm he had unleashed in my life, and how I had transformed it into power, into justice, into a lesson he would never forget. And as I sipped my tea, I whispered quietly to myself, "You left me in the cold, Darren. And now, you see what it feels like to be on the outside, powerless, exposed, and finally, alone." The taste of victory was sweet, not because I had crushed him, but because I had reclaimed myself. I had taken back control, honored my dignity, and shown that no betrayal, no matter how personal, could define me. The apartment was quiet again, truly quiet. No careless footsteps, no laughter that wasn't mine, no traces of betrayal scattered across the rooms. I walked through each corner, letting my fingers trail over the counters, the shelves, the familiar surfaces that had been my sanctuary long before Darren had arrived. It was mine again, all mine. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt the weight of the cold lift from my chest. I didn't celebrate. I didn't throw a party. The satisfaction was quieter than that, steady, deep, and unshakable. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the snow drift down in soft, silent swirls. Outside, the world moved on. People walked by, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded within these walls. But inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of freedom. I had reclaimed more than my apartment. I had reclaimed my dignity, my respect, my authority. My tenants now looked at me differently. Not just as the kind elderly landlord who baked pies and smiled politely, but as someone who had endured betrayal and emerged stronger, unbroken, clever, and decisive. They whispered about it occasionally, behind polite smiles and cups of coffee, admiring the calm way I had handled what could have been chaos. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of Darren online. His face, usually so smug, now carried an unfamiliar tension. Friends who had once fawned over his independence now kept their distance. He had lost the image he had carefully crafted, the illusion of a man who had it all together. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth spoke for itself. The world had watched, and he had been exposed. In those first quiet days, I reflected on what had happened. Betrayal cuts deeply, but it also teaches. It showed me who I could trust, who I couldn't, and what I was capable of when pushed to the edge. I had discovered patience, strategy, and a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I had learned that sometimes silence and observation were more powerful than confrontation, and that revenge, when executed with precision, could be as elegant as it was satisfying. I began to settle into a new rhythm. Mornings were mine again. I brewed coffee and watched the city wake up from my window. I checked on my tenants, making small conversation. Sharing advice, offering smiles, life felt lighter, freer. Evenings were for baking, reading, and quiet reflection. The world outside might be messy, chaotic, and unfair, but inside my apartment, I had restored order, and that peace was worth more than any victory over Darren. And yet, part of me still thought about him. Not with longing, not with regret, but with clarity. I imagined him walking through the streets, realizing too late that he had lost everything. His arrogance, his entitlement, his sense of invincibility, all gone. The people who had admired him now looked at him with quiet judgment. Friends, colleagues, acquaintances, all had witnessed the unraveling, and the moment he realized that I, the person he had underestimated, had orchestrated it, I savored it quietly in my mind. The phone rang one evening. My sister called. "Helen, how are you?" she asked, her voice warm but curious. "Better," I said. "Calmer. In control." She paused, then said softly, "Are you sure you're okay? Darren." I smiled faintly. Now, my parents call me every week, but I never answer. There was a pause on the line, then a soft laugh. "You always were clever, Helen. I'm glad you're okay." I hung up and looked around my apartment. I was okay, more than okay. I was stronger, wiser, and free. Freedom tasted like quiet evenings, like snow falling outside my window, like knowing that betrayal had been met with justice rather than despair. Sometimes, I replayed the moments in my mind, the cold day he left, the phone calls, the eviction notices, the slow unraveling of his carefully constructed world. And each time, I felt a calm satisfaction, not hatred, not vengeance for the sake of cruelty, but a deep, unshakable understanding that what had been taken from me had been returned tenfold. I thought about what I had learned. Life is fragile. Trust is precious. Love, while powerful, does not excuse betrayal. And sometimes, those closest to us, those we cherish most, are capable of the deepest wounds. But the strength to heal, to reclaim, and to rise above, that strength is within us, waiting to be discovered. I made my peace with Darren, not in forgiveness, but in recognition of what he had taught me. He had shown me my limits, and then I had shattered them. I had turned betrayal into empowerment. I had turned pain into action. And in the quiet aftermath, that was the sweetest victory of all. The building hummed with life. Tenants came and went, smiles exchanged, greetings shared. I moved among them with confidence, my presence steady, commanding, respected. I no longer feared exploitation or dismissal. I had learned the value of boundaries, of patience, and of meticulous planning. The world, for all its chaos, now seemed manageable. And then, one morning, as I brewed my coffee and looked out at the frost-covered streets, I whispered softly to myself, words that felt heavy with truth and triumph. And that was the day he realized he'd lost everything. I took a sip of tea and smiled. The snow outside drifted silently, as if the world itself had paused to honor the victory of patience, intelligence, and quiet resilience. Now, the past no longer haunted me. Darren's betrayal had been devastating, yes, but it had also revealed the depths of my own power. I was no longer a victim. I was the author of my own story, the master of my home, the guardian of my dignity. And in that quiet, warm apartment, I felt an unshakable certainty. Nothing and no one could take that from me again.